Hey there folks, welcome to History Hacked, where we unravel centuries of historical fraud and make it fun and easy. Today's episode is going to be a little different from our usual ones. It's going to be more of a slow burn, a deep dive into why our accepted historical timeline, the one endorsed by academic institutions and authoritative sources worldwide, is most likely incorrect. In fact, what I'm about to present to you will make you realize that it would have been a 1 in a million miracle if the chronologists of the Middle Ages got it right. And I'm creating this video because many people seem to reject the idea that our ancient history is, to some extent, a fraud. There's this unconscious belief that there is an overwhelming avalanche of evidence proving the accuracy of our established historical narrative, but most folks don't really know how our history was pieced together. As we've been told, historians have been able to accurately place nearly all significant events on a timeline since the 1800s. However, as you will see, that's not really true. I'm going to show you how it's calculated and present evidence suggesting that ancient history and medieval history is likely much younger than what nearly everyone believes. And whether it was by honest mistake or intentional deceit, many events in medieval history were duplicated and pushed back to ancient times in order to fill out a narrative for an era where there's actually very little surviving historical information at all. So this episode is for the alternative history skeptics out there. I'm going to challenge what you believe and kind of put you in a position where you have to defend the numerous disparities in order to maintain your paradigm. But before we get into that, I just want to take a moment to mention that if you want to support History Hacked, visit our Redbubble store for cool products. We got t-shirts, mugs, back-to-school accessories, especially if you're into Tartaria. Link is in the description, or just visit historyhacked.com/shop. Now, let's dive into how we ended up with the timeline we have today. You probably know much of the story. Sumer, believed to be the first known civilization, emerging around 6,000 years ago, followed by Egypt. Then we trudge through history, witnessing advancements in writing, technology, as we reach ancient Greece, and eventually ancient Rome. Rome kind of peaks out in the west around 200 AD. After that, it was this curious global regression in civilization, where all records, important languages, political systems, philosophies, architectural knowledge, mathematics, coinage, military technology, the knowledge of significant historical figures, and the main pagan religions were forgotten, earning this era the name the Dark Ages because we have very little information about this time, except that most ancient knowledge was lost. However, in the East, a considerable amount of written material was saved and eventually found its way back to Europe during periods like the Crusades and the Renaissance. In Europe, a few copies of ancient manuscripts were stored away in monasteries as kind of dead weight. And I'm saying they're dead weight because they were practically unreadable, and if deciphered, they would have been deemed heathen literature. So essentially, Europe in the 1400s had to relearn its history of the ancient world. In the East, this collapse was less severe than in the West. That's why much more information survived. Figures like Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Herodotus were reintroduced to Europe through Eastern sources. And you could clearly see the contrast in European culture between the 1300s and, let's say, the 1600s. All this classical knowledge, we were told, was rediscovered. And as the story goes, with this influx of knowledge, historians were able to accurately reconstruct the past. But, as you'll soon discover, they didn't get it right. In fact, there are numerous holes in the narrative that we've been handed. Our history, to put it bluntly, was miscalculated on a grand scale. So the foundations of our currently accepted chronology dates back to the 1400s when notable humanists like Manuel Chrysoloras, Platon, Bessarion of Nicaea, and others arrived in Italy. But the roots of our chronology really can be traced back to a guy named Eusebius Pamphilus. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering names here. There's going to be a lot of names that will be butchered in this presentation. But Eusebius was a classical Christian scholar who wrote a renowned work titled History of the Time of Genesis to the Nicene Council, allegedly in the 300 ADs. So most of our academic chronology stems from the so-called young earth view of creation, yet our current secular version of history comes from this supposedly classical Christian scholar Eusebius. I'm going to quote historian Elias Bickerman, a prominent historian who's often cited in discussions of ancient history. He said, and I quote, "The Christian historians have made secular chronology serve ecclesial history," end quote. And he also stated that the calculations made by early chronologists like Eusebius form, and again I quote, "the foundation of the entire edifice of Occidental chronological knowledge, with the year 4004 BC as the starting point." And to better understand how we arrived at our current chronology, we need to go back to the late 16th century. Enter a guy named Joseph Justus Scaliger, often hailed as the founder of modern chronology as a science. He published two groundbreaking works, Opus Novum de Immedation Temporum in 1583 and Thesaurus Temporum in 1606. However, given the climate of the time, this guy Scaliger couldn't really openly contradict church doctrine. So he reconstructed history while incorporating an almost unaltered version of Eusebius's chronology. It's kind of worth noting that Scaliger himself referred to Eusebius's work as, quote, divine. And even with the later advent of Darwinism and the progress of sciences like geology and archaeology, the historically accepted version of chronology is still based on claims that most historians and scientists would agree is not to be taken literally, which is, again, the 4004 BC of this beginning of the world. So Scaliger's chronology was primarily based on interpretations of various numeric data found in the Bible. For instance, he determined that the world was created on Sunday, the 23rd of October at the crack of dawn. That's quite a precise calculation. His work was further expanded upon by Jesuit scholar Dionysius Petavius in the early 17th century. Petavius' best-known books, De Doctrina Temporum in 1627 and Rationarium Temporum in 1652. So these books solidified the foundation of the chronology that we still accept today. So the big question is it accurate? So when it comes to dating ancient civilizations based on the biblical Genesis, it's crucial to understand that the dating of Genesis varied greatly among different sources. And let's take a look at some of these competing narratives. So the Antiochian dating by Theophilus, for whom the Apostle Luke originally wrote his two books, Theophilus puts the creation date at 5969 BC. We also have the Byzantine dating, also known as the Constantinople version. He places it at 5508 BC. The Alexandrian Aninian era suggests the creation date at 5493 BC. Sumerian dating puts it at 4700 BC. The Judaic version claims it's 3761 BC. St. Hieronymus sets it at 3491 BC. The dating of Hippolytus and Sextus Julius Africanus align with 5500 BC. And St. Augustine suggests 5551 BC. So as you can see, these dates fluctuate within a span of 2100 years, yet Scaliger supposedly chose the correct version to build his chronology upon. At least that's what you have to accept if you want to adhere to the official narrative. However, relying on the Bible during this era was complicated because there were various versions of church canon until it was solidified by the Trident Council between 1545 and 1563. Many books were destroyed and considered apocryphal. And it's also important to note that other chronologies existed during this Renaissance period, sort of coexisting with Scaliger's. For instance, some believe that the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, kind of from the 900s to the 1200s, was the direct descendants of the ancient Roman Empire. Jewish history allocates only 52 years to the Persian period, despite the fact that in Scaligerian history, Cyrus II and Alexander the Great were separated by 206 years. And the Franks considered themselves the descendants of the Trojans. So in the late 1500s, there were numerous competing chronologies. However, Scaliger and Petavius were the first to use the astronomical method to support their version of chronology. But, respected mathematicians at the time, people like Francois Vieta and Christopher Clavius, tried to disprove their reasoning. Nevertheless, the scientific veneer offered by Scaliger and Petavius proved sufficient for subsequent chronologists who inherited this narrative. But here's the thing. There are plenty of problems and internal contradictions with this version, so let's dive in and explore a few of them. One glaring issue with the timeline lies in Scaliger's chronology of Rome. Let's compare Aristotle's account of the founding of Rome. So according to Aristotle, Rome was founded by Aeneas and Ulysses immediately after the Trojan War, which was around 1225 BC. They named the city after the Trojan woman Roma, and there's other literary works that echo this narrative. The famous Chronicle of Orosius states that Aeneas departed from Troy and went to Rome. So if that's true, Aeneas, who participated in the Trojan War, founded Rome. It creates this discrepancy of 400 to 500 years with Scaligerian history. Historian N. Ransing notes that some versions of Roman prehistory claim that Romulus, as the grandson of Aeneas, again a 500-year discrepancy. Another version suggests that the city was named by Ramus, the son of Ulysses and Circe. German historian Benedict Nies remarks, and I quote, "Rome, as well as many other Italian cities, was considered to have been founded by the heroes of Greece," end quote. So these alternative versions clash with the Scaligerian paradigm. Additionally, the 14th century poet Petrarch, so he arrived in Rome with sort of preconceived notions of its ancient antiquity, and in his letters he expresses disappointment that none of the great buildings of ancient times that he expected to find in Rome were actually there. We're going to take a look at this quote from Petrarch. You know what? I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let's just do the voice to text.
Where are the Thermae of Diocletian and Kerala? Where is the Timbrium of Marius, the Septizonium and the Thermae of Severus? Where is the Forum of Augustus and the Temple of Mars the Avenger? Where are the holy places of Jupiter the Thunderbearer on the Capitol and Apollo on the Palatine? Where is the portico of Apollo and the Basilica of Keys and Lucius? Where is the portico of Livia and the theatre of Marcellus? Where are the Temple of Hercules and the Muses built by Marius Philip, and the Temple of Diana built by Lucius Cornifacius? Where is the Temple of Free Arts of Avinius Pollio? Where is the Theatre of Balbus, the Amphitheatre of Statilius Taurus? Where are the numerous constructions erected by Agrippa, of which only the Pantheon remains? Where are the splendorous palaces of the emperors? One finds everything in the books. When one tries to find them in the city, one discovers that they either disappeared or that only the vaguest of their traces remain.
So it's a kind of a confusing situation, and Petrarch wonders why he can't find anything. Now, there's a theory we've explored in other videos on our channel, and I'm not going to go too deep into it here, but suggesting that since these stories originated in the East, could they have been referring to the other Roman Empire, Constantinople? Now, check out some of our other videos in the links below to delve further into that topic, but let's go on. So Petrarch obviously came to Italian Rome with a prior certainty of the great Rome, as described in old books, is the Italian Rome. And he searched and he found nothing. Now let's go into some other glaring inconsistencies. This one revolves around Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who famously battled Rome in the First Punic War. Swiss anthropologist Georg Lovacki conducted some excavations in southern Italy and made kind of a startling discovery. There was actually no evidence of military action right in the area where Hannibal allegedly defeated Rome in the Battle of Cannae. Instead, he found some burrows of remains that belonged to victims of a 13th century plague epidemic, but no Roman soldiers. Another interesting fact about Hannibal is that the name, it disappears in the Dark Ages, of course, but it resurfaces as a medieval family name that was used by senators, warlords, cardinals for centuries in the sort of 1300s. It kind of goes along with this peculiar revival of, quote, ancient Rome within the Middle Ages, which leaves me wondering if some events from the medieval era made their way into the story of ancient antiquity. We have German historian Ferdinand Gregorovius, and I quote, referring to the Middle Ages, "The Roman populace has developed a new spirit over this time. It marched forth to conquer Tuscany and Latium as it done in ancient times. Roman banners bearing the ancient SPQR initials appeared on the battlefields yet again," end quote. So actually, how much of this medieval history was folded into the story of ancient history? Because there are many such parallels. And we also encounter a similar pattern in Greece as we do in Rome. Byzantium played a significant role in transmitting almost all the known ancient Greek manuscripts to the West. Austrian-American mathematician and historian Otto Neubauer writes that the majority of manuscripts forming the basis of our knowledge of Greek sciences are Byzantine copies made 500 to 1500 years after the original authors. German historian Ferdinand Gregorovius, that's hard for me to pronounce. He raises our eyebrows a little bit further when discussing the actual city of Athens. He remarks, and I quote, "In what concerns the actual city of Athens, its fate in this epoch," referring to the Middle Ages, "is covered by such impenetrable darkness." And he goes on to say, and I quote, "that the city of Athens has grown over with trees and weeds between the 6th and 10th centuries, and ended up burnt to the ground by barbarians. There is some firm evidence of the existence of Athens in the darkest era, but hardly anything can serve as more substantial proof of the city's complete disappearance from the historical horizon than the very fact that one has to prove the actual existence of what used to be one of the greatest cities in a country that is historical for the most part," end quote. Gregorovius proceeds to tell us the following, and I quote, "From the 7th century on, Greece becomes so unimportant for history that the names of Italian towns are mentioned a lot more by the Byzantine scribes than those of Corinth, Thebes, Sparta, or Athens. All that notwithstanding, there isn't a single word from any scribe that would mention the city of Athens conquered or described by invaders," end quote. So again, no information about Athens whatsoever in this period from the 5th to 10th centuries. In addition to the cities of Greece, Greek thought also seems to have fallen into oblivion during this period. The ancient philosopher Plato is said to have been revived by the renowned Neoplatonist Plotinus, who lived from 205 to 270 AD. Interestingly, the name bears a striking resemblance to Plato purely by coincidence. However, again, Neoplatonism eventually fades away, only to be revived again in the 15th century by another prominent Platonist named Platon. Coincidentally, the name also closely resembles Plato. So Platon establishes Platon's Academy in Florence. We're told that it's modeled after the ancient Plato's Academy. Both Plato and Platon delve into utopian works. Platon even attributed to a famous treatise on laws. However, we still have a full text of Plato's work with the same title that is preserved today. And this topic of duplicates in history is dense, and it deserves its own dedicated video, and we'll delve into more examples in the future, but I will just mention a few more duplicates. So let's go back to Eusebius, the aforementioned ancient chronologist who calculated the Genesis to 4004 BC. So Eusebius tells us about a renowned Dionysus who established the rules for celebrating Easter, linking it to the spring equinox. According to Eusebius, this Dionysus is believed to have passed away in 265 AD, according to the Scaligerian chronology. It's interesting, another well-known scientist named Dionysus lived in the 6th century AD, referred to as Dionysus Exiguus, which means Dionysus the Little. So he's credited with determining the date of Christ's birth for the first time, and he calculated the occurrence of Easter for the years ahead, kind of, again, aligning it with the spring equinox. So we have two prominent scientists, both named Dionysus, who delved into the dating of Christ. Additionally, we come across Dionysius Petavius, who we mentioned earlier, who kind of completed the chronology put forth by Scaliger, and he also contributed to the dating of the life of Christ. And it's kind of a weird coincidence that the name Petavius can be linked to the French word petite, meaning little. So it's quite a coincidence that both Dionysius Petavius from the 1600s and Dionysius Exiguus from the 580s, they were both referred to as Little Dionysus. Another duplicate from ancient Rome, we find a series of renowned Roman lawyers that culminates with Irenaeus Modestine, who passed away in 244 AD. So after this time, the whole discipline of Roman law seems to fade away, lost to the Dark Ages, and is revived 900 years later by Irenaeus, the guy with the same name. And that was in 1088 AD, so we're told. So shifting gears, let's touch on ancient Egypt for a bit. The accounts of ancient history by alleged Greek historian Herodotus from the alleged 400 BCs and the Scaligerian chronology differ significantly. Herodotus is widely regarded as the father of history. His primary focus is on the Greco-Persian wars in the 400 BCs. And if we take Herodotus out of the picture, if we got rid of his chronicles, much of the information concerning this conflict would be totally lost. Notably, Herodotus' chronology is considerably shorter than the Scaligerian version. The time intervals between the Egyptian kings, as described by Herodotus, is often thousands of years shorter than the corresponding periods presented by the oldest known copy of Metho's Kings List, which was actually discovered in Italy in the 1800s. So to illustrate these discrepancies a little further, let's examine the ascension of Menes, the first Egyptian pharaoh, to the throne. So a bunch of German scientists in the 1800s proposed various dates for this event. Again, some butcher names here, I'm not going to even try. Boeck, 5702. Unger, 5613. Bruch puts forth 4455 BC. Louth proposed 4157 BC. Lepsius suggested 3892 BC. Bunsen came up with 3623, and so on. The difference between the two extremes of these dates is 2079 years. This discrepancy only gets wider when we consider the dating offered by French Egyptologists. Champollion puts it at 5867 BC. Lesieur, 5770 BC, Mariette, 5004 BC, Chabas, 4000 BC, Mayer, 3180 BC, Andrzejewski, 2850 BC, Wilkinson, 2320 BC, Palmer, 2224 BC. So, for instance, the difference between Champollion and Palmer's datings equal 3,643 years. It's quite a discrepancy. So due to this confusion, the relatively recent field of Egyptology emerged. However, its early contemporaries were not entirely convinced by its findings. Chantempi de la Saussure, a Dutch historian from the late 19th century, stated that Egyptology, and I quote, has been the private domain of a very few researchers. Alas, results of their research have been popularized too hasty. Consequently, many erroneous views have emerged, and excessive trust in the research results has been lost. To this day, constructing Egyptian chronology remains an impossible task. And it's intriguing to note that figures like Isaac Newton also encountered issues with the chronology proposed by Scaliger and Petavius. Newton suggested that the ascension of the first Egyptian pharaoh, Menes, occurred in 946 BC, whereas it's commonly believed to have taken place in 3000 BC. Newton also shifted other fundamental dates in ancient history, such as the Trojan War, which he claimed happened in 904 BC instead of the widely accepted 1225 BC. Unfortunately, Newton passed away before completing a more comprehensive work on ancient chronology, and his chronological work faced criticism from historians who accused him of senility and saying he's basically incorrect because he lacked the ability to decipher cuneiform and hieroglyphs and didn't possess any knowledge of the then non-existent field of archaeology. Nevertheless, there were other authors who argued that ancient history was also much shorter than commonly believed. We have Jesuit historian Jean Hardouin, who believed that a significant portion of classical literature was written in monasteries during the 16th century. You have Robert Baldoff in his work History and Criticisms, published in 1903, argued that not only ancient history, but also the history of the early Middle Ages were forgeries created during the Renaissance era and subsequent centuries. And he relied solely on philological arguments to make this case. We have respected 19th century English professor and humanist Edwin Johnson, and he remarked that, quote, "We are much closer in time to the Greeks and Romans than the chronological tables indicate," end quote. And he called for a complete revision of the entire ancient and medieval chronology. These are just a few examples, but let's fast forward to the findings of a relatively obscure figure from the early 20th century, Soviet historian Nikolai Morozov. So Morozov authored several publications claiming to have proven that the entire history of the classical age had medieval origins. He proposed that Scaliger's chronology had been arbitrarily expanded based on the repetitions he discovered in the text that seemed to describe the same events, but were dated differently and considered unrelated in time. So Morozov believed that Christ lived in the 5th century rather than the 1st, and he even denied the existence of historical figures such as Julius Caesar, whom he believed to be Julian the Apostate and the Eastern Roman Empire, widely believed to have lived in the 300s. And he also suspected falsifications in the writings of Cicero and others, suggesting that they were referring to events in the Middle Ages. What's interesting is that Morozov had reached these conclusions that were similar to Isaac Newton and Edwin Johnson independently. Apparently, he did not know their work. Also, he did not extend his analysis beyond the 6th century and considered the generally accepted chronology to be largely accurate thereafter. So let's briefly talk about medieval times and whether our understanding of that period is also accurate. I want to draw your attention to Herbert Illig's intriguing work, Was There Really a Charlemagne? In this book, Illig claims that many documents that we attribute to Charlemagne's era are actually more recent forgeries. And he also suggests that we need to shave off about 3 centuries from medieval history. But diving into these distortions of perceived medieval history deserves its own dedicated video, which we'll explore in the future. So wrapping up, let's again consider the numerous figures who, time and again, they independently arrived at the conclusion that ancient history is shorter than what we've been taught. And this kind of leaves us thinking, how can we determine what's right? And for many, the answer lies in carbon dating. So can carbon dating validate the history we've learned? The answer, unfortunately, is a resounding no. There's a lot to unpack on this topic, and we'll cover this in one of our upcoming videos. Suffice it to say that carbon dating faces numerous challenges and is ill-suited for dating events that occurred within the last 2,000 years. So we'll do a deep dive on carbon dating soon, so stay tuned. But that's all I have for now. I hope this provided you with some valuable insights and some food for thought. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and reach out to us on Twitter at history_hacked. And if you disagree or have some evidence supporting the accuracy of the current timeline, we're always open to examining different narratives more closely, so let us know. And if you're going to be a dick about it or be insulting, as some people tend to be, you'll probably get some rudeness back or just be ignored. But if you have specific questions, feel free to ask. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our other videos and interviews. And if you want to support this channel and look stylish at the same time, visit our Shop Tartaria store. Link in the description for cool shirts, hats, back-to-school gear. Perfect for the Tartaria enthusiast. So with that said, until next time, thank you for watching.